The sky was burning. Kira pressed her trembling fingers against the communication panel as another explosion shook the ground beneath her feet. She was young, barely old enough to work at the relay station, but now she was the only one left. The others had fled or died. She remained because someone had to send the message. Through the cracked window of the station, she could see them. The Drakari ships hung in the orange sky like dark clouds made of metal and death. They were massive, each one larger than the tallest building in her city. For 3 days they had rained fire upon her world. For 3 days her people had screamed and run and died. The Lorathi were not fighters. They had never been fighters. Their bodies were small and fragile, with hollow bones that broke easily and skin that bruised at the slightest touch. They had built their civilization on peace, on art, on the gentle study of the stars. They had no weapons. They had no soldiers. They had nothing but hope, and even that was fading fast. Kira's hands moved across the panel. The distress signal was ready. It would travel across the galaxy, reaching every species that had ears to hear it. She knew what would happen. She had studied history. When the Drakari came for a world, no one helped. The galaxy watched and stayed silent. Other species were too afraid, too selfish, or too far away to care. But she had to try. She pressed the button and spoke into the microphone. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. She described what was happening. She begged for help. She said that her people were dying, that children were crying in the streets, that the Drakari were taking prisoners to eat or enslave. She said all of this, and then she said something else. She said, "Please." The message flew into the void. Kira sat back and waited for nothing. Across the galaxy, the signal reached 100 worlds. On most of them, officials listened and then turned away. The Galactic Council received the transmission and held an emergency meeting that lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, they decided to do nothing. The Lorathi were too weak, the Drakari too strong. Intervention would be costly. It was not their problem. On a cold station orbiting a blue and green world called Earth, a young officer received the signal. He listened to it twice, his face growing pale. Then he ran to find his commander. Admiral Taiho was 53 years old. He had gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen too many battles. He sat in his office aboard the Earth Fleet Command Station, reading reports about supply lines and training schedules. When the young officer burst through his door, he looked up with calm patience. The officer placed a data chip on his desk. Admiral Taiho inserted it into his terminal and pressed play. Kira's voice filled the room. She sounded young and terrified and brave all at once. She described the fire and the ships and the screaming. She described the Drakari dragging families from their homes. She described the bodies in the streets. Admiral Taiho listened without moving. When the message ended, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window. Outside, he could see Earth floating in the darkness, his home world. His people had fought wars for thousands of years. They had killed each other over land and gold and ideas. But they had also learned something important. They had learned that some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was high. The young officer spoke nervously. He reminded the admiral that Earth had no treaty with the Lorathi. He said that the Galactic Council had already decided not to act. He pointed out that the Drakari were dangerous, that their fleet was enormous, that humans had never fought them before. Admiral Taiho turned around. His face was hard, but not angry. He asked a simple question. He asked if the officer had children. The young man said yes. He had a daughter 3 years old. Admiral Taiho nodded slowly. He said to imagine that daughter running through burning streets with no one to help her. He said to imagine her crying out and hearing only silence in return. Then he asked another question. He asked what kind of people would hear a child screaming and do nothing. The officer had no answer. Admiral Tejo walked to his desk and pressed a button. His voice echoed through the station, reaching every ship, every soldier, every officer in the 7th Expeditionary Force. He told them what was happening. He told them about the Lorathi, a peaceful people being slaughtered by monsters. He told them that no one else was coming to help. Then he said the words that would change everything. He said that humanity did not need a treaty to help someone who was screaming. He said that they were going. Within hours, the fleet began to move. 12 warships powered up their engines. 3 carriers loaded fighters into their bays. Thousands of Marines checked their weapons and said goodbye to their families. They did not know if they would survive. They went anyway. The galaxy watched in confusion. Other species had heard stories about humans, the strange creatures from a world called Earth. They knew that Earth was a death world, a place of crushing gravity and violent weather and endless predators. They knew that humans had evolved to survive things that would kill any other species. They called humans Deathworlders and spoke of them in whispers. But no one understood why the Deathworlders would risk themselves for strangers. The Lorathi had nothing to offer. They were weak and far away. There was no profit in saving them, no advantage to be gained. The mathematics of the galaxy said to stay home. Humans had never been good at mathematics. On the burning Lorathi homeworld, Kira sat in her ruined station and waited to die. The Drakari were getting closer. She could hear their ships overhead, their soldiers marching through the streets. She had done everything she could. The message was sent. No one had answered. And then her communication panel lit up. A new signal was coming in from far across the stars. She pressed the button to receive it, expecting nothing. Instead, she heard a voice. It was deep and calm and human. The voice belonged to Admiral Tejo. He spoke clearly so that she would understand every word. He said that her message had been received. He said that help was coming. He said to hold on, because the fleet was on its way. Kira stared at the panel. She did not understand. She had learned about humans in school, how they came from a terrible world, how they were built for violence and pain. She had seen pictures of them, tall and dense and frightening. Her people told stories about Deathworlders to scare children at night. Now those monsters were coming to save her. She put her head down on the panel and cried. Outside, the sky kept burning. But for the first time in 3 days, Kira felt something other than fear. She felt hope. Far away, Elder Vel, the leader of her people, received the same message. He was old and tired and had already accepted death. When he heard the human admiral's words, he wept too. Not from sadness, but from something his people had forgotten how to feel. The Deathworlders were coming. The galaxy had turned away, but humanity had answered. The fleet jumped into the void, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. The battleship Indomitable was a monster made of steel and fire. It stretched nearly a kilometer from bow to stern, covered in armor thick enough to stop almost anything. Inside its belly lived 2,000 humans, each one ready to fight and die for people they had never met. Captain Sujin stood on the bridge and watched the stars blur as the ship entered faster than light travel. She was 41 years old, with sharp eyes and short black hair streaked with early gray. She had commanded this ship for 6 years. She had fought pirates and rebels and things that came from the dark places between stars, but she had never faced the Drakari. No human had. She turned to face her crew. They sat at their stations, checking systems and running calculations. They were scared. She could see it in the way they moved, the way they kept glancing at their screens. But they were also determined. That was the thing about humans. Fear did not stop them. It only made them angry. Lieutenant Minho sat at the tactical station, his fingers dancing across holographic displays. He was young, only 26, but he had one of the sharpest minds in the fleet. Admiral Tejo had personally requested him for this mission. His job was to study the enemy and find a way to beat them. He had been reading about the Drakari for hours. The information was not good. The Drakari were ancient, far older than humanity. They had been conquering worlds when humans were still living in caves. Their bodies were built for war, tall and covered in hard shells like insects, with 4 arms that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through metal. They did not feel pain the way other species did. They did not know mercy. They believed that the universe belonged to the strong and that the weak existed only to serve or to be eaten. In 10,000 years of conquest, the Drakari had never lost a war. Minho looked up from his screen as Captain Sujin approached. She asked him what he had found. He told her the truth. He said that the Drakari were faster, more numerous, and more experienced. He said that their weapons were powerful and their tactics were brutal. He said that by every calculation, the human fleet should not be able to win. Sujin listened quietly. Then she asked him if he had ever seen a human give up. Minho thought about it. He had grown up on Earth, in a city that flooded every year. Every year the water came and destroyed homes and killed people. Every year, the survivors rebuilt. They never stopped. They never surrendered. They just kept going, because that was what humans did. He shook his head. He said no, he had never seen a human give up. Sujin nodded. She said that was why they were going to win. Deep in the ship, Sergeant Yuna gathered her Marines in the armory. There were 50 of them, men and women in heavy armor designed to keep them alive in the worst conditions imaginable. They carried rifles that fired metal at speeds fast enough to punch through walls. They carried knives and grenades and medical kits. They carried everything they needed to fight a war on the ground. Yuna was 35 years old with scars on her face and hands that told stories she never spoke about. She had been a Marine for 15 years. She had fought in jungles and deserts and frozen wastelands. She had watched friends die and enemies fall. She knew what war cost. She looked at her soldiers and spoke plainly. She told them that the Lorathi were not fighters. She said that they were small and fragile, that a human child was stronger than an adult Lorathi. She said that the Drakari were killing them by the thousands, taking them as slaves and food. She said that nobody else in the galaxy cared enough to help. Then she asked if anyone wanted to stay behind. No one moved. No one spoke. They all stared at her with hard eyes and set jaws. They were ready. Yuna almost smiled. She told them to check their gear and get some sleep. The fight was coming soon. In the medical bay, Dr. Hana reviewed everything she knew about Lorathi biology. She was 38 years old, a doctor and a scientist who had spent her career studying alien life. She had gentle hands and a soft voice, but her mind was sharp as any blade. The Lorathi were fascinating and fragile. Their bones were hollow, like birds, which made them light but easy to break. Their eyes were large and sensitive, designed for dim light. Their bodies could not handle the gravity that humans lived in every day. A single Earth day would crush a Lorathi flat. Hana thought about what the Lorathi must think of humans. To them, Earth would be a nightmare world. The gravity alone would kill them. The weather would terrify them. The predators, the diseases, the earthquakes and storms and fires that humans survived without thinking would be apocalyptic events. And yet, the creatures from that nightmare world were coming to save them. She wondered if the Lorathi would be more afraid of their rescuers than their attackers. She made a note to be gentle when they arrived. Someone would need to show the Lorathi that humans could be kind. The fleet traveled through the void between stars. 12 warships flew in formation, their engines burning bright against the darkness. 3 carriers followed behind, filled with fighter craft and bombers. Thousands of humans moved through these ships, preparing for battle. Admiral Taiho sat alone in his quarters and looked at a photograph. It showed a woman and 2 children, smiling on a beach on Earth, his family. They were safe at home, waiting for him to return. He did not know if he would. He thought about the message he had sent to the Lorathi. He had told them to hold on. He had promised that help was coming. Now he had to keep that promise. He stood up and walked to the window. The stars streaked past like rivers of light. Somewhere ahead, a world was burning and innocent people were dying. The galaxy had decided they were not worth saving. Humanity disagreed. Tai-Ho pressed a button on his communicator. His voice reached every ship in the fleet. He told his people that they were almost there. He told them that the enemy was strong and cruel and had never been beaten. He told them that the odds were against them. Then he told them something else. He said that somewhere on that burning world, a young girl had sent a message into the darkness, hoping that someone would hear. He said that she had expected silence, because that was all the galaxy had ever given her people. But she had not received silence. She had received an answer. He said that humanity was that answer. On the Lorathi homeworld, Kira clutched a small radio and listened to the human transmission. She did not understand all the words, but she understood enough. The Deathworlders were close. They were coming. Outside, the Drakari continued their slaughter. They did not know that death was approaching from the stars. They did not know that they had finally met an enemy that would not run away. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Lorathi system. The stars steadied. The engines hummed. Captain Sujin stared at her screen and saw the enemy. Hundreds of Drakari ships filled the space around the burning world. They were everywhere, like a swarm of locusts devouring everything in sight. She smiled grimly and gave the order. The battle had begun. The Lorathi system was filled with fire and death. Drakari warships covered the sky like a dark blanket, hundreds of them moving in perfect formation. Below, the planet burned. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were now broken ruins. Smoke rose from the surface in thick black columns that could be seen from space. Admiral Tai-Ho stood on the bridge of his command ship and studied the enemy formation. The Drakari outnumbered his fleet by at least 10-1. Their ships were fast and deadly, designed for quick strikes and overwhelming attacks. They moved like predators, circling the wounded planet and picking off any Lorathi ship that tried to escape. He opened a channel to the entire fleet. He told his captains that this was the moment. He said that the Lorathi were counting on them, that innocent lives hung in the balance. He said that he was proud to serve with all of them. Then he closed the channel and waited. The Drakari noticed the human fleet almost immediately. Their sensors detected the 12 warships and 3 carriers emerging from the void. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Drakari had never seen human ships before. They did not know what to expect. Then a transmission came through. It was from the Drakari command vessel, a massive ship that dwarfed everything else in the system. The creature speaking was Warlord Goss, the leader of this invasion fleet. Goss was old, even by Drakari standards. He had conquered 17 worlds and enslaved billions of creatures. He had fought 100 battles and won them all. His shell was covered in scars from a lifetime of war, and his eyes were cold and empty like pits of darkness. He studied the human ships with mild curiosity. He had heard stories about Deathworlders, the creatures from the nightmare planet called Earth. He knew they were strong and dangerous, built for survival in conditions that would kill any other species, but he did not fear them. The Drakari feared nothing. His voice came through the communication channel, translated into human language by computers. He told the humans to leave. He said that this world belonged to the Drakari now. He said that if they departed immediately, he would not pursue them. He said that this was their only warning. Admiral Tai-Ho listened to the warlord's words. He thought about the burning cities below, the families being torn apart, the children screaming in the streets. He thought about Kira's message, the desperate plea that had crossed the stars. He responded calmly. His voice was steady and cold. He said that the warlord had misunderstood the situation. He said that humanity was not asking for permission to pass. He said that the Drakari had 2 choices. They could surrender and withdraw from this system, or they could die. There was silence for a moment. Then Goss laughed. It was a terrible sound, like rocks grinding together. He said that no species had ever defeated the Drakari. He said that humans would learn their place, like all the others before them. He said that their bones would decorate his throne. Then he gave the order to attack. The Drakari fleet moved like a wave. Hundreds of ships surged forward, their weapons charging, their engines screaming. They expected the humans to flee or scatter. That was what prey always did when the Drakari came for them. The humans did not flee. Captain Sujin stood on the bridge of Indomitable and watched the enemy approach. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. She had been born for this moment. All of humanity had been born for this moment, shaped by millions of years of survival on a world that tried to kill them every single day. She gave the order to engage. The human fleet moved forward to meet the attack. 12 warships, outnumbered and outgunned, charged directly into the enemy formation. It was insane. It was suicide. It was exactly what humans did. The first Drakari weapons struck Indomitable on the port side. The ship shook violently, alarms screaming through every corridor. Damage reports flooded the tactical station. Lieutenant Minho read them quickly and almost laughed. The armor had held. The Drakari weapons had barely scratched the surface. Human ships were built differently than other vessels. They were heavier, slower, covered in layers of armor that would be impossible for lighter species to use. They were designed not for speed, but for survival. They were designed to take punishment and keep fighting. Indomitable returned fire. Its main guns roared, sending massive projectiles across the void at speeds that turned them into weapons of pure destruction. The projectiles struck a Drakari cruiser and tore through it like paper. The enemy ship exploded in a ball of fire. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Human ships absorbed blow after blow, their armor holding against attacks that would have destroyed any other fleet. Then they struck back with weapons that hit harder than anything the Drakari had ever faced. Warlord Goss watched from his command ship with growing confusion. This was not how battles were supposed to go. Enemies were supposed to run. Enemies were supposed to die quickly. These creatures did neither. He ordered more ships forward, trying to overwhelm the humans with numbers. But the human formation held. They fought in perfect coordination, covering each other, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the space between them into a death trap. On the Lorathi homeworld, survivors looked up at the sky and saw something impossible. The dark cloud of Drakari ships was being pushed back. Bright flashes of light marked explosions as enemy vessels died. The Deathworlders were winning. Elder Vel stood in the ruins of his council chamber and wept openly. He had lived for 200 years. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had watched his people slowly accept that they would always be prey for stronger species. Now he was watching something he had never imagined possible. The monsters from the Deathworld were fighting for them. The creatures that other species told horror stories about were dying to protect strangers they had never met. In space, the battle raged on. A Drakari cruiser rammed into Indomitable, tearing a hole in its side. Atmosphere rushed out into the void. Crew members scrambled to seal the breach. Captain Sujin ordered damage control teams to the affected decks and kept firing. Lieutenant Minho tracked enemy movements and called out targets. His voice was hoarse from shouting, but he did not stop. Around him, the bridge crew worked with mechanical precision, each person doing their job without hesitation. On the lower decks, Sergeant Yuna helped seal a breach with her own hands. The metal was hot enough to burn through her gloves, but she kept working. A Marine beside her took shrapnel to the leg. She dragged him to safety and then returned to the breach. That was the thing about humans. They did not stop. They did not surrender. They just kept going until the job was done, or until they were dead. Warlord Goss finally began to understand what he was facing. These were not ordinary creatures. These were survivors of a world that made monsters. They had been forged in fire and hardened by endless struggle. They were everything the Drakari claimed to be, and more. For the first time in his long life, Goss felt something he did not recognize. It took him a moment to name it. It was fear. The battle continued, and the sky began to clear. The dropships fell from the sky like metal rain. Inside each one, human marines sat in silence, their weapons ready, their faces hidden behind armored helmets. They had trained for this moment their entire lives. They had fought in jungles and cities and frozen wastelands, but none of them had ever fought on an alien world against an enemy like the Drakari. Sergeant Yuna checked her rifle one final time and looked at her squad. 50 soldiers, the best she had ever served with. They were about to drop into a burning city filled with monsters. Some of them would not come back. They all knew it. None of them complained. She spoke through her helmet radio. She told them that their mission was simple. They were going to land in the capital city, find the civilians trapped in the central bunker, and get them out. She said that the Drakari would try to stop them. She said that the Drakari would fail. The dropship shook as it entered the atmosphere. Through the small windows, Yuna could see fire and smoke rising from the planet below. The Lorathi homeworld had been beautiful once. Now, it looked like a wound in the universe, bleeding light and ash. They landed hard in a ruined plaza. The doors opened, and the Marines poured out, spreading into defensive positions. The air smelled like burning metal and something else, something organic and terrible. Bodies lay in the streets, Lorathi civilians who had not escaped in time. Yuna looked at them and felt her jaw tighten. The Drakari came almost immediately. They emerged from buildings and alleys, their massive forms moving with surprising speed. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in dark shells that gleamed like wet stone. Their forearms ended in claws that could cut through armor. Their faces were nightmares, all mandibles and compound eyes and hunger. Yuna opened fire. Her rifle roared, sending metal death across the plaza. The projectiles struck the first Drakari and punched through its shell. The creature stumbled and fell. More took its place. The battle became chaos. Marines moved through the ruins, fighting room to room, street to street. The Drakari were strong and fast, but the humans were relentless. Every time one fell, another stepped forward to take their place. They did not retreat. They did not break. A Drakari warrior charged at Yuna, its claws raised for a killing blow. She rolled aside and fired point-blank into its chest. The creature collapsed, but its claw caught her arm, slicing through her armor and drawing blood. She ignored the pain and kept moving. That was the difference between humans and other species. Pain was not a command to stop. Pain was just information. Humans had evolved to process that information and keep fighting anyway. In orbit, the space battle reached its climax. The human fleet had destroyed nearly half of the Drakari armada, but they had paid a price. 2 warships were gone, torn apart by concentrated enemy fire. 3 more were badly damaged, their crews fighting to keep them operational. Captain Su Jin stood on the bridge of Indomitable and watched her tactical display. The Drakari were retreating toward their command ship, trying to regroup around their warlord. She saw an opportunity. She contacted Admiral Taiho and proposed a plan. She wanted to lead a strike directly at the command ship, kill the warlord, and the Drakari fleet would lose its coordination. It was dangerous. It might be suicide, but it could end the battle in one blow. Taiho was silent for a moment. Then he gave his approval. He told her to be careful. She almost laughed. Careful was not something humans did well. Indomitable surged forward, leading 3 other warships in a wedge formation. The Drakari tried to stop them, but the human ships pushed through, absorbing fire and returning it tenfold. Lieutenant Minho guided their weapons with precision, targeting enemy engines and weapon systems, clearing a path through the chaos. On the ground, Yuna and her Marines reached the central bunker. The doors were sealed from the inside, designed to withstand bombardment. She could hear movement on the other side, the soft sounds of frightened creatures trying to stay quiet. She removed her helmet and pressed her face against the door. She spoke in a calm, gentle voice, using the few words of Lorathi language that Dr. Hannah had taught her. She said that she was human. She said that she was here to help. She asked them to please open the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard the locks clicking open. The door slid aside, and Yuna found herself face to face with hundreds of Lorathi civilians. They were small and fragile, barely reaching her waist. Their eyes were huge with fear, and they trembled at the sight of her armored form. To them, she must have looked like a monster. She knelt down slowly, making herself smaller. She smiled, though she knew her face was bloody and dirty. She said that everything was going to be okay. She said that the Deathworlders were here and nothing would hurt them again. A young Lorathi child stepped forward. She was tiny, barely larger than a human baby, with silver fur and enormous golden eyes. She reached out one small hand and touched Yuna's face. Her fingers were soft and warm. Yuna felt tears on her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. Dr. Hannah arrived with a medical team moments later. She immediately began treating the wounded Lorathi, working with gentle hands and quiet words. The aliens watched her with wonder. They could not understand how creatures so terrifying could also be so kind. In orbit, Indomitable reached the Drakari command ship. Warlord Goss watched the human vessel approach and knew that the battle was lost. His fleet was broken. His warriors were dying. Everything he had built over centuries of conquest was crumbling before his eyes. Admiral Taiho opened a channel one final time. He offered Goss a chance to surrender. He said that if the Drakari left this system and never returned, they would be allowed to live. Goss refused. He said that the Drakari did not surrender. He said that death was preferable to dishonor. Taiho nodded slowly. He said that he understood. Then he gave the order. Indomitable fired everything it had. The main guns roared. Missiles streaked across the void. Fighter craft swarmed the enemy vessel, pouring fire into its weakened hull. The command ship shuddered and began to break apart. Warlord Goss died screaming as his ship exploded around him. His last thought was of the humans, the creatures from the death world who had done the impossible. They had beaten the Drakari. They had proven that the universe was not only for the strong. The remaining Drakari ships fled. They scattered in every direction, running from the battlefield as fast as their engines could carry them. They had come as conquerors. They left as survivors. On the ground, the Marines watched the enemy dropships retreat. The Lorathi emerged from their bunkers and shelters, blinking in the smoky light. They looked at the human soldiers standing among the ruins, these terrible creatures covered in blood and armor. And then, slowly, they began to cheer. The battle was over. The Deathworlders had won. The guns were silent. For the first time in days, the sky above the Lorathi homeworld was clear. The smoke still rose from the ruined cities, but the fire was fading. The Drakari were gone, scattered across the galaxy like leaves in a storm. They would not return. Admiral Taiho stood on the observation deck of his command ship and looked down at the wounded planet. The cost had been high. 2 warships destroyed. Hundreds of humans dead. Thousands more wounded. But they had done what they came to do. They had saved the Lorathi. He thought about the people who had died under his command. Good men and women who had left their families behind to help strangers. He would remember their names. He would make sure the galaxy remembered them too. On the surface, the work of healing had begun. Human soldiers who had fought like demons now moved through the ruined streets with supplies and medical equipment. They cleared rubble and searched for survivors. They carried Lorathi children on their shoulders and shared their food with hungry families. Sergeant Yuna sat in the ruins of the capital city, her armor dented and scorched from battle. She had not slept in 2 days. Her body ached with exhaustion and wounds she had ignored during the fighting, but she was smiling. A group of Lorathi children had gathered around her. They were small and fragile, with silver fur and enormous eyes that reflected the light. At first, they had been afraid of her. She was a monster from the death world, tall and covered in hard armor, with a face marked by scars. But she had removed her helmet and sat down in the dust and waited. Slowly, they had come closer. One brave child had touched her hand, then another. Now they sat around her in a circle, listening as she taught them a simple human game. She drew shapes in the dirt with a stick and showed them how to play. Their laughter rang through the empty streets like music. One of the children asked her a question. The translation device in her ear turned the Lorathi words into something she could understand. The child wanted to know why the humans had come. She wanted to know why anyone would fight for them. Yuna thought for a moment. Then she said that humans believed something important. She said that when someone was hurt and scared and crying for help, you did not look away. You did not calculate whether it was worth your time. You just helped, because that was what good people did. The child did not fully understand, but she smiled anyway and went back to playing the game. Dr. Hana worked in a field hospital that had been set up near the central bunker. She had been operating for hours, treating wounds that would have killed a human 10 times over. The Lorathi were so fragile. A broken bone that a human would barely notice was life-threatening to them. But she worked carefully, using techniques she had developed just for this mission, and she saved every life she could. Elder Vel came to see her late in the day. He was the leader of the Lorathi people, old and wise and tired beyond words. He had seen his world burn. He had watched his people die. He had expected to join them. Now he stood before a human doctor, a creature from a world of nightmares, and tried to find words that could express what he felt. He asked the same question the child had asked. Why? The Lorathi had nothing to offer. They were weak and peaceful, with no military and no wealth. They could not repay this debt. They could not even understand why it had been offered. Hana looked up from her work. Her hands were tired and her eyes were red from lack of sleep. But she smiled gently at the old alien. She said that humans did not help others because they expected payment. She said that kindness was not a transaction. She said that when someone asked for help, the only right answer was yes. Elder Vel was silent for a long moment. Then he bowed deeply, in the Lorathi way of showing respect. Tears fell from his enormous eyes. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The Drakari, the ancient conquerors who had never been defeated, had been broken by a fleet of Deathworlders. The humans had come from their nightmare planet and done the impossible. They had fought for strangers and asked for nothing in return. The Galactic Council held an emergency session. Representatives from 100 species gathered to discuss what had happened. Some were afraid. If humans would fight for strangers, what would they do for friends? What would they do if someone threatened Earth itself? Others felt something different. They looked at the reports from the Lorathi system and saw hope. For thousands of years, the galaxy had operated on simple rules. The strong took what they wanted. The weak suffered and died. There was no justice, only power. Now there was something new. There was humanity. Admiral Taiho was invited to address the council. His hologram appeared in the great chamber, surrounded by aliens of every shape and size. They watched him with curiosity and fear and wonder. He spoke simply, without anger or pride. He said that humanity had heard the Lorathi crying for help and had chosen to answer. He said that this was not complicated. It was not strange. It was simply what people should do. Then he said something that echoed through the chamber and beyond. He said that humanity would never stand by while innocents suffered. He said that if any species in the galaxy needed help, they could call, and humans would come. He said that this was not a threat. It was a promise. Some of the council members shifted nervously. Others sat straighter, as if hearing something they had waited their whole lives to hear. On the Lorathi homeworld, Kira sat in the rebuilt communication station. She was the young woman who had sent the first distress signal, the desperate message that had reached across the stars. She had expected silence. She had received salvation. Now she was writing. She was recording everything that had happened, from the first Drakari attack, to the arrival of the human fleet, to the battle and the victory and the kindness that followed. She wanted the galaxy to know. She wanted history to remember. She wrote about the monsters who came from the Deathworld. She wrote about how they had fought like demons and then helped like angels. She wrote about Sergeant Yuna teaching children to play games in the ruins. She wrote about Dr. Hana saving lives with gentle hands. She wrote about Admiral Taiho standing on the bridge of his ship and ordering his people to die for strangers. When she finished, she read over her words. They did not capture everything. No words could, but they were a start. She ended with a simple line, a truth that she wanted every species in the galaxy to understand. When the Lorathi cried out, they expected silence. Instead, the Deathworlders answered. They came not with conquest, but with kindness, armored in steel. They taught the galaxy that strength without compassion is nothing, but compassion backed by strength can change everything. Kira sent the message out into the void. It traveled through the darkness, reaching world after world. And everywhere it went, beings looked up at the stars and thought about the Deathworlders, the terrible, wonderful humans who had proven that the universe could be better. Somewhere on a blue and green planet called Earth, families welcomed their soldiers home. They had gone to save strangers. They had returned as heroes. And in the darkness between stars, the galaxy held its breath and waited to see what humanity would do next.